Hi, I'm Sandy Lowries, and today in the Confessional, I'm actually excited to be talking to Stephanie Wood. Imagine falling in love with someone that you've met online, and he's warm and he's generous and he's fab, only to discover down the track that his entire identity and the stories that he's told you are a complete and utter lie. This is Stephanie Wood's story. Stephanie has captured this story about Joe, a fantasist, in her novel, Fake, where she tells this incredible story, and as the relationship starts to unravel, she breaks up with him and her journalistic instincts kick in, with a need to discover what the real truth is. This is an incredible book and I urge everyone to rush out and buy it. Stephanie joins me today to chat about her experience and her journey, and how this cautionary tale has actually impacted on the lives of many, many women who have reached out to her experiencing similar situations. Stephanie is an award-winning former staff writer for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald's Good Weekender. She is currently a freelance writer and her book is available in all good bookstores. I'm so thrilled that she joined me today to talk about love, loneliness, sex, dating, and the pitfalls that can happen. Welcome to Stephanie Wood. Hello, Stephanie Wood.
Hi,
Welcome.
how are you, Sandy?
I'm great. Welcome to the Confessional. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I hope you don't make me confess too much more than I've already done in the book. that was hard enough.
Well, your book is kind of the perfect theme, I guess, for joining us in the Confessional. Really about unique kind of stories that women have to tell, and yours is an incredible story. I have to say, first up, I am a huge fan of the book and of your work, because it's so beautifully written.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think in the hands of someone else, it may not have come across the way that it did. I think it's so fantastic. So
thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
So thank you. So for those, I guess, who don't know what your work is about, what the book is about, Fake, because obviously, you know, you're an award-winning journalist, you're an incredible writer, but this is actually a true story, and your story.
Yeah, that's right. Bearing all, in a way, yes, possibly too much, but you said it was a unique story, but it's actually not, because I've just had hundreds. I originally wrote the story as an article for Good Weekend magazine, which I was a senior staff writer on. I took a redundancy to write the book, but I received a deluge of messages, Facebook private messages and emails from people telling me that they'd had similar experiences with similarly crazy, duplicitous. I was going to swear then, but I'll try and keep
You are allowed to swear in the Confessional. Yes, I love it. I have an expression which my daughter laughs consistently about, but if someone's a real ass, I call them a fucking fucker.
Yeah, you could use a lot of fucks for these sorts of people, definitely. But yes, I've received just the hugest volume of messages and mail and just people pouring out their stories. And why I started to tell you that was because by me bearing so much of myself and my vulnerabilities, I think that's made people much more comfortable in sharing their stories with me, and they've just without you know, they've just sent unsolicited messages telling me in great detail their own stories, which who would have ever thought that this was such a major issue and that there were so many of these fuckers out there.
Yeah, and I think that's what was kind of really mind-blowing about the book. So I have read the article as well that you wrote in Good Weekend. I, you know, was divorced, suddenly single, you know, as a woman at 41. I have to think how many years ago that was now, but 10 years ago. And so I was sort of out there as a single woman who'd been in a very, very long-term relationship marriage, who hadn't dated. And so for me, the whole idea of dating was new, and the whole idea of going on dating apps was so new. And who knew that going on dating apps so fraught with interesting adventures, but also a lot of crazy people out there.
Yeah. I should say, I don't think these sorts of people are just found on dating apps. I think you can bump into them through other walks of life. But I think that what dating apps do is that they take away any context in terms of how you've met this person. You don't know their friends. You're not at a bar where their friends are with them. You're not in a workplace, or it's not introduced to you by a friend or family member. So the context of who they are and the truth of their being is just not there in an online dating situation. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is so fraught, the online dating sphere.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us about, so for those who haven't read the book, this is kind of I know I keep saying it's extraordinary. I guess it's extraordinary because you've told it, but as you say, it's not necessarily.
Yeah, and I got out of it so lightly compared to so many people. And again, I should just give another rider. Women are capable of this behaviour as well, without question. And I've heard from men saying that this has happened to me. This woman did this to me as well. One expert that I interviewed for the book, who sort of counsels, is a counsellor based in Florida in the US, working in this kind of space. She said that she hears from an equal number of men and women, but the correspondence I've had suggests it's way more men are by way more the guilty parties. So there's no stats to tell us one way or the other, but I will refer to the masculine guilty partner because I think that that's probably way more prevalent. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really interesting point as well. And I know that you have made that point before, but I think, you know, it is important. Yes, women are capable of all sorts of things, but the reality is I think a lot of what we read and a lot of what we see is that it tends to happen to women more. And yes. I don't know whether it's because women are more, and I can't speak to this either. I don't know in terms of stats, but whether or not we're just more trusting, that we believe that when someone comes forward, when you're meeting someone new, what they tell you, you just assume they're telling you the truth.
Or is there a disproportionate number of men who behave this way? Who knows?
Right?
Who knows?
Who knows? And that's why this is so fascinating, this journey. So for you, the journey starts with it was through a dating app that you met this particular gentleman. I'm not going to call him a gentleman. He's not a gentleman.
No.
You met this man, and I like that in the beginning of the book you refer to him as the man. We'll call it Joe. You called
Joe
him
was the name I gave him. Yes.
Okay, so you meet this guy in a bar.
After meeting him online through a dating app, yes. Yeah. We had a drink in a bar, and I was really underwhelmed, and actually left thinking, oh well, I won't hear from him again, and I couldn't care less. But he got in touch again and said, let's go out again. I really enjoyed that. And excuse my scratchy throat. I've been single for a few years, and I'd been celibate for a few years, and I had been lonely for a few years. And as I've said in other interviews I've done, through my 20s and 30s, I moved around an awful lot for work. I got great jobs in London and Hong Kong and Melbourne. I'm a Queenslander originally. I moved to Sydney when I was my late 30s. And so I'd led a very transitory life, and that means that you're not your anchors and your roots don't go very deep in terms of friendship circles. My childhood friends and my school friends were in Queensland, as were my university friends. And then I had friends just scattered in every city that I'd ever worked in. So, loneliness goes with that territory. I'd be very surprised if other women or men in that situation hadn't felt, the clutch of loneliness. And so I suppose that was an initial vulnerability, but it also made me probably think, I'm just going to give this a go. If he says I'll go out, he wants to go out with me again, okay, why not? And there were some very appealing things that he said about himself. Nothing turned out to be true. But he, the things that he said about himself and claimed to be former architect, retired from that, now had a small farm in the country where he ran sheep, property dealer, developer, wheeler and dealer, interested in the environment, slightly left wing. Also, I thought, what else? Loved trees and nature, and he seemed gentle and kind and just decent. And those were all really appealing things. You know, he sailed. I've longed to have a partner that sailed. So on paper, it all looked pretty interesting. The second date was a little bit more appealing, maybe because we drank a bit more, and I think we should be removing alcohol from every date henceforth, because it completely distorts. No more drinking on first dates, second dates, or third dates, even longer than that. It totally distorts your everything. It makes you such a sucker. And we had a bit more fun, and then so it went. I kept on going, oh well, what's the harm, and we kissed on the fourth date. And then
I think like it's so beautifully, like, I will encourage anyone who hasn't read this book to go out and read this book. And I'll be 100% honest with you, Stephanie, that I have lent my copy to my girlfriend Teresa, who's out there. I'll get it back, but she is out there sort of dating. And I just think this book resonates with so many women, even if you haven't had the same experience. I know for myself, being out in the dating circuit as a woman in her 40s, I met some pretty dubious people that I imagine if I was in a different space, that I could have easily have ended up in exactly that same kind of relationship. And so this is why, for me, it's important that you told this story and the story is getting out there.
It's a very natural human instinct to want to be with someone else, to want the physical intimacy and the emotional intimacy. There's nothing wrong with that instinct. And, one of the big refrains that I've heard from countless women that have contacted me is, I'm an intelligent woman. How could that have happened to me? How could I have been so fooled? Well, there's many answers to that, but a couple of the important ones are, and I try some of them are tied up with their own vulnerabilities, but I think it's more, I'm going to start to re-emphasize, change the emphasis. These people are incredibly clever.
Yeah.
They're really, really, really clever at how they go about their dastardly work. But, aside from that, how our heart works is not how our head works. They're very different operating systems. And, you can be I've heard from doctors and lawyers and, okay, no lawyers got in touch with me that I can remember, but lecturers and philosophers and like people with multiple degrees, and saying, I'm an intelligent woman, this is what I've done in my life, and yet I fell for this fucker.
Yep.
But I think it's really important that we disengage the head and the heart. They're not the same thing. And when we do think we're falling in love, as I try and outline in the book, our navigational systems, our brain chemistries are completely out of kilter. Things change hormonally, and our brains are working in very strange ways. And our decision-making capacity is actually reduced.
But, Joe, like men like him, like these fuckers, as you say, they're kind of really adept at honing into other people's insecurities, other people's fears. They're very clever in the way that they make you feel that somehow it's your fault if they have let you down. And I mean, in some ways, this is very narcissistic, right? These are narcissistic qualities.
Yeah, well, as I go on to, I'm not obviously a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I'm not able to diagnose Joe with any specificity, but I can say that his behaviours very, very clearly match everything I understand to be malignant narcissism, even antisocial personality disorder. He has characteristics that very much fit with those clinical diagnoses and I talk a lot about that in the book, Personality Disorders. And it's actually really interesting. I think personality disorders, from what I know now, cause way more trouble in society than we have any sense of, any understanding. And I was actually reading an article this afternoon from the States about vexatious litigants in American courts, and the number of them that have personality disorders. They're the sort of people that you know, in a divorce court or in a family court here, for example, they refuse to let go. They refuse to admit they're wrong, and they are prepared to just go and go and go, and never let go of the bone of pursuing their partner in the court system, even if their arguments are ridiculous and fallacious and whatever. So, yeah, personality disorders is a really interesting subject area that I'd like to look at more.
Yeah, I think I love the sort of that you touched on that and those themes in the book as well. And that, you know, I suppose for yourself being thrown into this situation probably led you down that path more. But yeah, I think it's quite fascinating. But having said that as well, the reality is that I think it would be easy for some of these people to hide behind that as well. To excuse pretty hideous behaviour in the way that they treat other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So with Joe, who pretended he was a former architect and then a farmer with a cute dog.
Very cute dog.
Very cute dog. His, you know, I suppose it was a compounding of so many lies that probably was his undoing in the end, the unraveling of that. But what was it that made you start to think, I've fallen in love with this person, or you've fallen in love with the version of himself that he has presented, and which is more than fair enough, because in reading the book you see all of those, you know, the lovely qualities that he projected, I guess. What was that moment for you where you started to think, oh, something's really not right here?
There wasn't one moment. As I outline in the book, I suffer a little bit of anxiety in various situations, and my anxiety levels just spun out of control while I was with him progressively, particularly because he cancelled a real lot. Like, I never knew whether he was actually going to turn up or not, and there would always be some incredibly complex, not laboured, that's not the right word to use, but very complex, detailed excuse as to why he couldn't be where he was meant to be to see me. And my anxiety levels grew and grew. And then there were inconsistencies. He'd say one thing and then the next week he'd be saying something different. So the contradictions had me really kind of scratching my head. And through this, I was Googling a lot, trying to find out a little bit more about him. And he has a very, very light internet footprint, very little to be found about him. Although what I did found confirmed what he'd said about himself. One of the things being that his grandfather had been a very prominent Australian businessman, and that checked out. Like, there was a physical resemblance that was unmistakable. So there were things about, you know, his story that were true. So I checked him out on Google as much as I could, but it was a series of just the contradictions in his stories, the not seeing things. I never saw his house. I'd seen that his driver's license that showed he lived in a harbourside address, and that his family was connected to this suburb, and I'd been able to find traces of that through Googling. But he kept on coming up with reasons why I couldn't see his house. And I know, you know, every woman knows if he's not going to show you his house, something's going on. You know, I knew that before I even met the guy. But this is how clever they are. His reasons for not having me at the house were just so utterly compelling and convincing. And I did say to him, it will be a deal breaker. You know, I do need to see your house. And he said, yes, I understand that. But then he was able just to spin it out and out and out. Initially, his children weren't ready for another woman in their life. What else?
Which
his
is
mother
believable.
was staying over. Sorry?
Which is believable, right? So
absolutely. And, you know, like to think of myself as a reasonable, kind person with a tender heart. And I knew that, you know, I was dealing, if these children were traumatized from what he said was a very difficult marriage breakdown and that his ex-wife was a psychopath, you know, I thought, I'm dealing with a really difficult situation and I need to step lightly here. You know, I'm not going to be a bull at a gate. You know, these kids, you know, what sort of person would I be if I just barged in there? And so I accepted that. And then his mother was staying, and then his floorboards were, or no, her floorboards were being polished, and she was staying with him. And then a renovation was happening to his house because he needed to make it bigger as his kids got bigger. And so everything was packed into boxes, and then there. And there were some occasions when he invited me for dinner. They were cancelled. So I'd get all excited and think, this is it. He's finally letting me into what he described as his bubble. And then they'd be cancelled as well, with yet more excuses. So in a long answer to your short question, it built up over a long period of time, my great anxiety and my sort of realisation that something's not really right here. And there were, I'll leave it for the book, for people to read the book, to sort of see the dramatic moments that sort of tipped me over the edge into going, right, I'm out of here. But I did eventually tell him to piss off, which still gives me a small amount of satisfaction.
Which is fantastic. And, like there's this, I think as a reader of this story and a follower of, of this, and seeing articles after the book came out as well, I was such a champion for you in that, and this is something I really want to discuss with you here today, is this kind of concept, as I sort of touched on it before, but that when women are duped by terrible behaviours, that then people turn it around and somehow want to blame the victim of that behaviour rather than the perpetrator of that.
Yeah.
And so for you, to be brave enough to write the story, like what did you think people would, or how did you think people were going to react to the story? Were you really nervous when you first went to publish?
Yeah. The first exposure was the Good Weekend article that came out in 2017, and the Good Weekend magazine comes out on Saturdays, but the articles go up online on the Friday afternoon. And I was in the office that afternoon, and someone said, "Oh, it's gone live, Stephanie," and I swear I nearly fainted on the newsroom floor. I was my legs turned to jelly. Yeah. I think I imagined I would get trolled, that people would tell me how stupid I was, and I was actually really pleasantly surprised. I've had very little of that, really hardly any. It was really the feedback to that original article and subsequently the book was just overwhelmingly supportive and loving and generous, and I can see, just lovely. And as I said at the beginning, when we first started to talk, people telling me their stories as well, and also saying, thank you, you make me feel a resolution in my own self. And so that's been really lovely to know. A lot of people have said, you're my hero. And it's like, no, I'm just pretty ordinary. But it's nice, It's really nice that I've had some small impact on a few people. That's really nice.
I think the really interesting thing about the more women that I speak to, this comes up time and time again, of how resilient and how extraordinarily brave women are, but we don't particularly see ourselves as being that.
No.
So you are a hero.
It goes with modesty, doesn't it? You don't want to blow your own trumpet.
Yeah.
And I feel as if I did get out of it really lightly. He never asked me for money. And that's another thing that I think is really important in my story, at least, is because I as I said, I knew that, of course I knew if a guy's not going to show you his house, warning. Mm-hmm. And I knew that if he asks you for money, warning. But he never asked me for money. And so I'd go over in my head and I'd go, he hasn't asked me for money. So, must be, if he was a con artist, he'd be asking me for money. So that was another thing that tripped me up. I didn't know that there were men in the world that would behave this way for a motive that seems so, there was no apparent motive. I mean, I just couldn't see what it was. I mean, he seemed really into me. And, I understand, of course, men have affairs, but, we were in the, first year of our relationship. And I kept on thinking, maybe he's seeing another woman. Maybe that's, but, what, we're new, why? So, my brain in that year, 14 months that we were together, was just absolutely haywire.
Wow. And the other thing that he did with you too was that he actually, it's like lying in full daylight, is in that he introduced you to people.
Yeah, well, his children and a friend of his. Yeah. Yeah.
And so to me, like the two most important people in this man's life would be his children.
Yeah.
And it makes complete sense to me that, any doubts that you were having, and then he introduced you to the children.
Yeah. And that was reasonably early in proceedings as well. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was fairly early on in proceedings, within maybe 3 or 4 months, I think, 4 or 5 months. I can't remember exactly, but yeah. And so that was another thing. He's introduced me to his children. Finally, okay. 1, they exist. 2, I'm in. So, and in hindsight, I can see that he probably was absolutely terrified about me meeting the children, because they could have at any point let slip information, certainly about his residential address, which was not the one that was on his driver's license. Yeah, he must. I think and in hindsight, he brought that meeting. I had dinner with the kids and at a restaurant, and he brought it to an end very, very quickly. His son was sick, he said, but I don't know whether the son know that he was sick. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that was the thing. I suppose there was so many twists and turns, and I don't want to give too much away either, because I want people to read the book.
Oh, the twists and turns.
So many twists and turns. And I was like, every woman who has read your book, I'm sure going through the same amount of emotions that I was reading it.
The interesting thing is, I only showed about half the twists and turns, because I thought it would have been super boring if I'd actually really gone into all of the there's lots that I couldn't include for length, and people would have just switched off. It would have become so tedious, and I had to abbreviate the twists and turns, so it's like there was more.
It was incredible. I think what was really fantastic is when you kind of switched into journo mode. The journalist in you just came to the fore. It's like you had to know answers, and you're.
I mean, the other thing is, it's such a ripper story. Like, journalists spend their lives looking for great stories, and this one happened to me. I was inside this. It was. I don't think there was ever a point at which I wasn't going to tell the story. I mean, I was pretty shell-shocked in the early days, and there was no way I was ready to do it for a while, but I think I always knew I had to tell it, because it was just so gobsmacking.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so when you wrote the Good Weekend article, at that point in your mind, though, were you thinking, I could write a book about this, or you were just really wanting to get it out?
It was always a book in my head.
It was always a book? Wow.
Yeah. And in fact, if you want to know what Joe thinks about this, Joe has said to me via email, which I never respond to. He emails me every so often, which is a great delight and joy in my life to see his name in my inbox. Always ignore them. But Joe's theory is that I knew from very, very early on in the relationship that he was a really bad guy and was lying to me. So I stayed in the relationship because I wanted to get a book out of it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because that's what women do.
Yeah, no, I'm that cunning.
Wow.
And that malevolent and manipulative that I stayed in the relationship because I wanted to write a book.
Wow.
And I think Joe probably is under the misapprehension that books earn women people lots of money. He probably thinks I'm rolling in it. Well, Joe.
Poor Joe, you silly man. Because
you silly man.
I've got a lot of friends who are authors, and believe me, Australian authors are not rolling in it. So
nope. Absolutely not. But no, I just planned the whole thing to get a book out of it.
Stephanie, of course you did, because that's what women do. You just hoped you'd fall into this relationship with this lying.
Yeah, because I actually went looking for a man that would lie to me so I could do it.
And that's the thing, right? In saying it out loud, it just sounds ludicrous, but the fact that he's still trying to get you to believe.
Oh, I'm the enemy. I'm the nasty one in all of this.
Look, I think I think he should feel incredibly lucky that he wasn't completely named.
Oh, absolutely, and he could have been.
Oh yeah.
there was certain legal issues, but that we looked at. But certainly for the Good Weekend article, we nearly named him.
Ooh.
So he should be extremely grateful that didn't happen, I guess. I was a bit concerned for a while because someone on Twitter said, "Oh my God, I've got to find out who Joe is. Who's Joe?" I'm on a search now, and I thought, "Oh God, oh no, what's the legal implication of this?" And thankfully, I never heard anything else. One person did message and said they'd found out who he was, and that they were correct.
Oh, wow.
Drawing very, very obviously clever researcher, very clever researcher.
Wow.
But thankfully the "Who is Joe" meme didn't get out.
Well, it's kind of fascinating because I think was your book out before Dirty John came out, or it was just going to publish when Dirty John came out? I can't remember.
I wrote about Dirty John in the book.
I'm sure you did.
So Dirty John must have come out before my book did. Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
But I think it's kind of a reference at the end. So I think it must have just come out, before you went to print maybe.
Maybe a few months, because there was obviously a long lead time. That chapter would have been written in late 2018. No, listen, I've lost track of time. But no. Dirty John had been out for a little bit of time, yeah. And then, of course, there was Who the Hell is Hamish?
Exactly, right?
So, it goes on and on and on.
It just really does. And so one of the things that you really, I just kind of loved that, and you write about this in the book, and don't want to give too much away, but you did contact Benita Alexander, who is an NBC producer.
Did you know of her story before
I did not know of her story until you wrote it in the book, until I read the book. And so for me, I was, what? How did I miss this?
And it was a huge Vanity Fair article a year or two before my book came out about her story. I hadn't read it. And so when I read your book, the first thing I start doing is I start going back and I'm looking at Benita's story as well, which is quite extraordinary. So for those that don't know, another really intelligent, dynamic woman who was basically scammed, and he was what was he called? Was he calling himself a celebrity surgeon? Yeah, and he was a surgeon, just an extremely unethical, dodgy one.
Yeah. And so she's pretty much scammed by this man as well. I think that and I'm so glad that you sort of touched on the stories of women who had reached out to you and who you had reached out to, because it drives home the point that, and I think what resonated with me and what resonates with most women who I've discussed your book with have all said the same thing, that absolutely it could happen to any of us. Absolutely.
Yeah, if you are in a vulnerable position and it could do.
One of the things, I was discussing this with some girlfriends actually quite recently, and they were pretty excited that when I said you were going to come on the podcast. But one of the things I was talking about as well is that, when I was single and I started dating, even though I had children and even though, all the things, I still felt lonely, even though my friends were actually close by and that I had this really wonderful group of friends. I still felt really lonely. And so I think there is that kind of tie into what you were saying before about how, it doesn't really, you can be lonely in a sea of people. You can be lonely in a room full of people.
Yeah.
So I think this kind of looking for love, but it's also quite interesting that you write about this in the book, how we as women are raised, and this kind of fairy notion that we have in our head that we're going to find the one and that we're in love and it's going to be happily ever after.
Yeah. And it's not for very many people. It's not.
Yeah. There's a lot of women out there who are, single, who have either been married, never been married, whatever our circumstances are. But I think, what would your advice be, I guess, on, is there a way that people can protect themselves from this kind of fuckery? I'm going to call it fuckery because...
Fuckery. Yeah. Fair enough. Listen, it's hard, isn't it? Because in my book, I've listed a number of sort of things that I would be much more careful about now, sort of red flags to watch out for. Any man that says his ex-wife is a psychopath would be out Um, yes, you want to see their house pretty soon. If they're always negative about other people, if it's always someone else's fault, whatever problems have beset them in their lives. There are a lot of things that I could see now. Sadly, and I haven't been dating, I'm not particularly interested in going back into that quagmire, but that swamp. But I think I'd find it really hard to trust again. So, you know, that's pretty sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trust is going to be really hard.
And that's what he's taken from you, and
Yeah,
that, you know, and I think
that will be the lingering result of this. Yeah,
yeah.
unfortunately, and that makes me really mad. But I haven't seen anyone I want to try and trust. So
Yeah, and you know, I can understand that. That's the thing. Going out and dating anyway puts us in a vulnerable position. So when you've been hurt, when you've kind of been scarred, for any woman who has actually been with a narcissist, they will attest to that as well. It's very difficult to kind of piece yourself back together and trust that someone else isn't manipulating you, right? So
yeah.
So
All that said, though, I should say I feel stronger and better about myself than I ever have in my life. So he gave me more than he took away, shall I say?
yeah, because I think one of the beautiful parts I found in this book was actually there were two stories going on. One is your story with Joe, and the other one really was your story. It was about you coming to sort of going through your own journey as a woman and as a strong woman, and coming out on the other side and actually seeing yourself in a different light, which I thought was really empowering as well.
Yeah, I thought when I started to think about the structure of the book, I knew I had to have an uplifting ending. I just wasn't gonna let him win. I was determined about that. So yeah, I worked really hard for that ending, to make it right.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful ending, and
it didn't need to have a man in it. It wasn't about getting a man.
That was what was most empowering to me, was exactly that. And so it was kind of almost like a love story of you falling in love with you. And I think that that's such a beautiful and engaging kind of thing, because as you say, like, yes, it started out as you looking for love and you found it, just not in the way that you thought you were going to find it. So that's kind of pretty empowering. And so what now, Penny Wood? Like, are you working on anything new at the moment?
Trying to. I have another idea for another book, but I'm making very slow progress on it at the moment. As you'd know, my industry, the media, newspaper, magazine industry, has just been absolutely slaughtered by the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I've been a freelancer now since I took my redundancy. And freelancing was never a great way to earn a living as a writer, but it's way, way less of a great way to earn a living. So at the moment, it's a really, listen, I'm so lucky compared to so many people. I know there are a lot of people doing it so hard out there, and I'm fortunate on many levels for many reasons. I've got some savings, I'm fine, but they're not going to last me forever, and I'm going to really need to have to start thinking about, can I somehow find a sustainable career as a journalist, or will I need to do something else? That won't stop me writing, of course, but yeah, it's like so many people, I'm up in the air at the moment about how I'm going to pay the mortgage in the years ahead. And like, I'm way off retirement age, but retirement's not really an option. I wouldn't want to, like, my work is so important to me that retirement wouldn't be an option anyhow. But yeah, no, it's a really tricky time. I've got lots of dribs and drabs of work, but that keep me busy. Like, I've got a lot to do, but nothing that's going to, nothing that is going to pay my mortgage for the long term. Yeah.
Yet. I am so grateful to you for coming on this podcast. I love the book. I think you're an extraordinary writer. The one thing about you, Stephanie Wood, is you are an incredible storyteller.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. give me my hit of confidence for the day so that I can come back tomorrow morning and try and keep plugging away at this project.
You can do it. But look, I it is true. It's a remarkable book. I strongly everybody go out and read it if you haven't already. I know that this book gets talked about a lot in women's circles and amongst women because, as I said, for anyone who's been out dating ever, when you want to, we all discuss these red flags and green flags and things, but there is this kind of undercurrent that we all recognise that if it hasn't happened to us, that we're actually quite lucky. And so I think I was actually reading recently, was it on your Twitter or on your Facebook, but somebody had a go at you about after listening to an ABC interview that
that was my Facebook. I bit.
Good. So thank you for sharing your hard-won knowledge with us and for sharing yourself in this extraordinary book. It was an incredibly brave thing to do. And I think that it will be extraordinarily helpful for any woman who's gone through anything even remotely similar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to your quality podcasts. We chat to really interesting women telling their amazing stories, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for all of your support. Bye for now.